He used his body as a shield. But why? A dying whisper unleashes a furious vengeance no one saw coming. Loyalty is tested, an empire strikes back, and a secret code changes everything. If you're new here, subscribe and comment your location. Now let's begin. The roar of the bikes was a sound Mercy knew well. It usually meant trouble for her little 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial zone. But tonight, it was different. 3 of them walked in, leather cuts adorned with the infamous Death's Head, and took their usual corner booth. Mercy, a waitress with tired eyes and a quick smile, brought them coffee without being asked. Their leader, a mountain of a man named Mark with a sultan pepper beard, gave her a small nod. "Thanks, darling." The bell over the door jingled again. 2 men in hoodies walked in, hands in their pockets. The air changed. It went from the low rumble of biker talk to a sharp, silent stillness. Mercy felt it first, a cold prickle on her neck. She was refilling Mark's cup when one of the hooded men pulled out a gun. "Wallet now, everyone on the floor," he screamed, his voice cracking. Chaos erupted. A trucker at the counter dropped his plate. The other hooded man vaulted over the counter, shoving the cook aside to get to the register. Mercy froze, the coffee pot shaking in her hand. The gunman turned toward her, his eyes wide and wild. "You two, get down." But her legs wouldn't move. The gun swung up. And then a blur of black leather. Mark didn't charge. He simply stood up, stepped in front of Mercy, and spread his arms. He was between her and the gun, a human wall. The gunshot was deafening in the small diner. Mark grunted, a hard, punched-out sound. He didn't fall. He took another step back, pressing Mercy firmly against the service counter, shielding her completely with his body. The second shot hit him, and his knees finally buckled. He slid down to the floor, his back against Mercy's legs, trapping her in a protective pocket between the counter and his body. The thieves, panicked, fled with a few $100 and a dead man's watch from the trucker. Silence, then screaming. Mercy scrambled out from behind Mark, her hands covered in the warm, dark blood spreading across his chest. His 2 brothers, David and Paul, were already at his side, applying pressure with bar towels. "Stay with us, Prez. Look at me," David said, his voice rough but steady. Sirens wailed in the distance. Mark's eyes, pale blue and clouded with pain, found Mercy's face. She was sobbing, holding his hand. Why did you do that?" she whispered. He tried to speak, coughed, and blood trickled from his lips. He pulled her closer, his voice a wet, fatting breath only she could hear. "Had to tell Elena, Wildfire, she'll know." He took one more ragged breath, and then his eyes fixed on something far away. The life left them just as the paramedics burst through the door. The scene was pure madness. Police tried to question the shocked bikers, but David and Paul were in a world of their own. They watched the medics work, their faces carved from stone. When one young EMT approached Mercy, she was crying too hard to speak. The EMT, a guy named James, asked her what happened. She pointed a trembling finger at Mark's body, now being zipped into a bag. He used his body as a shield for me." David heard it. He walked over to James, his presence immense. "You get him to St. Mercy, you treat him like a king, you understand?" There was no threat in his tone, just a terrible, heavy command. At the hospital, in the cold, bright hallway, the club gathered. More than 20 members stood in silence. The doctor came out, took off his glasses, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, we lost him. The bullets pierced his aorta. He was gone before he got here." David didn't cry. He turned to Paul. He said something to the waitress. "Last words, did you hear?" Paul shook his head. They found Mercy sitting on a plastic chair, wrapped in a shock blanket, staring at her blood-caked shoes. David knelt in front of her, a giant brought low. "Mercy, my name's David. Mark was my brother, my president. What did he say to you?" She looked up, her eyes haunted. He said, "Tell Elena, Wildfire," he said she'd know. A current went through the 2 men. They shared a look that held a lifetime of secrets. Elena was Mark's old lady, his wife. She lived upstate, had been out of the life for years after their son died. Wildfire was not a word, it was a code. An old, buried code from a war they thought was finished. It meant one thing: the threat wasn't random. It was a hit, and the club had been asleep. "He didn't shield her from a robbery," David said, his voice a low growl. He shielded her from assassins who were there for him. They used the robbery as cover. Back at the clubhouse, an old warehouse, the mood was volcanic. Grief was being forged into rage. Elena was brought in, a beautiful woman in her 50s with streaks of gray in her black hair. When David told her Mark was gone and told her the word, her face went white. Then hard. "Wildfire," she whispered. "The serpents. It has to be. They said they'd burn everything down if we ever crossed them again. That was their word." Years ago, the Hells Angels had shut down a meth operation run by a gang called the Iron Serpents, who tried to move in on their territory. It ended in a bloody street fight and a silent truce. The Serpents had whispered wildfire as a warning, a promise of total destruction if the Angels ever came for them again. The Angels had thought it was empty talk. Mark had remembered. David stood before the assembled club. They didn't just kill our president, they broke the silence. They used a robbery to try and hide it. They think we're old, we're soft. They think we run a legit empire now and won't get our hands dirty. He pounded his fist on the table. They are wrong. We do not give up our empire. We protect it. We avenge it. The plan was military. They used their legitimate businesses, a sanitation company, a private security firm, a tow truck service, as weapons. Within an hour, David's sanitation trucks broke down at key intersections, blocking traffic. His security guys in official-looking uniforms cordoned off the areas, telling police radio they were assisting with a gas leak investigation. Tow trucks created a third layer of blockade. In 60 minutes, 3 entire city blocks in the grimy district where the Serpents operated were locked down tight. No cops, no civilians, no way out. Police scanners went crazy, but the Hells Angels had friends in low places. A dispatcher, an old friend of the club, fed confusing information to the patrol cars, sending them on wild goose chases across town. Inside the blockade, it was a different world. David and Paul, leading a group of 10 brothers, moved on foot. They weren't in cuts now, they wore dark, practical clothing. They looked like contractors, except for the grim purpose in their eyes. Their first stop was a rundown pool hall called the Rusty Q. David kicked the door open. The few serpents inside jumped up. "We're looking for the guys who did the diner job tonight," David said calmly. A skinny man with snake tattoos laughed nervously. "Diner? We don't know nothing about no diner." Paul walked over to the pool table, picked up the 8-ball and weighed it in his hand. "See, our president died at that diner. He was a good man. He liked simple things, like pool." In a flash, he whipped the heavy ball across the room. It connected with the skinny man's knee with a sickening crack. The man screamed and collapsed. The room went dead quiet. "I'll ask one more time," David said, leaning over the writhing man. "The diner, who did it?" Through gritted teeth, the man spat out 2 names. Finn and Cole. They bragged about a side job. They're at the Flophouse on 3rd, apartment 4B. The Flophouse was a decaying brick building. David and Paul took the stairs. At apartment 4B, they didn't knock. David kicked the door near the lock, and it splintered open. Inside, 2 men were dividing cash on a stained mattress. Finn and Cole. They looked up, eyes wide with terror. They went for guns under the pillow, but they were too slow. Paul was on Cole, a heavy sap in his hand coming down once, twice. The man went still. David had Finn in a chokehold from behind. "Who paid you?" David hissed in his ear. "Who ordered the hit on Mark?" Finn gasped, clawing at David's arm. "Don't know a name, a suit, a businessman. He paid us $5 grand to make it look like a robbery, said the big biker at the corner booth was the target." "A suit," David repeated. "This was bigger than the Serpents. This was a businessman using street trash as tools." Paul found a burner phone in Cole's jacket. The last called number was labeled Money Man. David took the phone, dialed the number on speaker. It rang twice. A smooth, cultured voice answered. "Is it done?" David smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. "It's done. The biker's dead. You got our money." A pause. "You're not Finn." "No, I'm the guy who killed Finn, and I'm coming for you next. You messed with the wrong family." The line went dead, but it was enough. The voice was familiar to Paul. That sounds like Richard Thorne, the developer." Thorne was a legitimate businessman who had been trying to buy up the industrial zone for a new condo project. The Hells Angels, through their shell companies, owned several key lots and had refused to sell. Mark had refused to sell. The puzzles snapped together. Thorne hired low-level serpents to eliminate the obstacle, making it look like street crime. A simple, clean corporate takeover. Back at the clubhouse, the news spread. The target wasn't another gang. It was a rich man in a penthouse. Elena was there, sipping whiskey, her anger a cold flame. "So a suit thinks he can burn down our life for a condo view," she said. "We'll show him wildfire." But first, they had to deal with the serpent leadership. The club's tech guy, a younger member named Leo who looked more like a college student than a biker, was a wizard with computers. He hacked into the city's traffic light system. At exactly 11 p.m., every light in the serpent's main neighborhood turned green, then red, then green again, creating total gridlock and confusion. In the chaos, a convoy of angels on their Harley-Davidsons, the roar of their engines like rolling thunder, rode straight into the heart of the serpent territory, to their supposed secret clubhouse above a tire shop. They found the serpent president, a man called Viper, trying to escape out a back window. David dragged him back in. "You sold your boys out as hired guns to a suit," David said, slamming Viper against a wall. "You broke every rule we have on the street." Viper, scared, confessed. "Thorne offered us 50 grand and a clean pass to operate if we got rid of Mark. It was just business." "This," David said, his fist connecting with Viper's face, "is just business." They left Viper tied up with his own bike chain, a note pinned to his chest for the police to find later, detailing his crimes. The serpents were finished. Now came the hard part. Richard Thorne. He lived in a secured high-rise with private guards. This required a different approach, a heist approach. Here the light-hearted moment came. To get into the building, they needed to look the part. The next morning, David, Paul, and Elena, who insisted on coming, stood in a rental garage, staring at 3 ridiculously expensive designer suits and a sleek cocktail dress. They looked like they'd rather wrestle a bear than put them on. Paul struggled with his tie. "This thing is a noose. I feel like I'm choking already." David, looking at himself in a mirror, grimaced. "I look like a lawyer who's about to have a very bad day." Elena, adjusting the elegant dress, smirked. "You both look like penguins who lost a fight. Now suck it up. We're going to a penthouse party." Leo had gotten them invites to a charity gala Thorne was hosting in his building's top-floor ballroom. Their fake IDs said they were investors from out of town. The plan was to get face-to-face with Thorne. The party was a world of glitter and champagne. The bikers moved through the crowd, feeling utterly out of place, but hiding it behind scowls they hoped looked like boardroom intensity. Elena was a natural, laughing and chatting, her eyes constantly scanning. She found Thorne, a handsome man in his 60s with silver hair, holding court near a panoramic window. She walked up to him, a glass of champagne in her hand. "Mr. Thorne, Elena Vance, my associates and I are admirers of your work on the South Side." She gestured to David and Paul, who gave stiff nods. Thorne smiled, charmed. "Thank you, my dear. It's a passion project, cleaning up the city." "I'm sure," Elena said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Though I heard you've had some local resistance from some motorcycle enthusiasts." Thorne's smile tightened. "A minor setback, handled." This was the charged chemistry moment. David stepped closer, invading Thorne's personal space. The civility dropped. "Handled? You mean murdering a good man in a diner?" His voice was low, a dangerous rumble only Thorne could hear. Thorne's face went pale. He tried to back away, but Paul was behind him. "I think we should discuss your development plans in private," Paul said, gripping Thorne's elbow with iron strength. "Your office, perhaps." They maneuvered him through the crowd, smiling and nodding, a deadly trio escorting their prey. In Thorne's luxurious, chrome and glass office, they shut the door. The facade vanished. David shoved Thorne into his own leather chair. "You hired the serpents. You killed Mark." Thorne tried to bluster. "You have no proof. You're trespassing." "My gods." "Your guards are currently enjoying some very strong coffee in the service elevator," Elena said calmly, "courtesy of our catering company." She picked up a framed photo from his desk. It was Thorne with the mayor. "You wanted our land. Mark said no, so you decided to remove him. You thought we were just thugs you could sweep away." "It was a business decision," Thorne snapped, fear turning to anger. David leaned over the desk, his face inches from Thorne's. "We are a business, a family business, and you attacked our CEO. That demands a merger." Their plan was not to kill him. That was too easy and brought too much heat. Their plan was to own him. Leo had spent the last 24 hours digging. He had found everything: shell companies, tax fraud, bribes to city officials, enough to put Thorne in prison for 3 lifetimes. David slid a tablet across the desk. On it were scanned documents, photos, bank records. "You will sign over all your development rights for the industrial zone to our holding company. For $1, you will then become a silent partner in our operations. A very, very silent partner. You will funnel your clean money through our legitimate businesses. And if you ever breathe a word or try to cross us again, this entire file goes to the FBI, the IRS, and the newspaper." Thorne looked at the evidence, his confidence crumbling. He was defeated. He signed the papers with a shaking hand. As they left the penthouse, taking the service elevator down, they stripped off their fancy jackets and ties, tossing them in a trash bin. Back in their leathers, they felt like themselves again. The next day was Mark's funeral. It was a massive procession of hundreds of bikes, a roaring tribute that shook the city. Mercy was there, invited by Elena. She stood at the graveside, tears streaming down her face. After the burial at the clubhouse wake, Elena pulled Mercy aside. "He loved saving people," Elena said, her voice thick. "It was his thing. Even when our son died, he just wanted to protect. You gave him a chance to do that one last time." Mercy nodded. "I don't have family here." He felt like family in that moment. Elena looked at her, then at David, who was watching them from across the room. A silent understanding passed. "Your family now if you want to be," Elena said. "The diner, we own the building it's in. It's yours, run it, be safe, we'll be your best customers." That night the club celebrated Mark's life. The mood was still heavy, but there was a thread of victory running through it. Their empire was secure, stronger than ever. The threat had been crushed and turned to their advantage. David stood on a chair, raising a glass. "To Mark, a brother, a president, a shield, we ride for him always." The cheer was deafening. As the music started, David found himself next to Mercy, who was helping behind the bar. Their hands brushed as he took a beer. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She looked up at him, this giant, fearsome man who had just orchestrated a takeover of a city block and a billionaire's empire to avenge his friend. "I will be," she said, and for the first time since the shooting, she truly believed it. Outside, the city lights glittered, unaware of the war that had just been fought and won in its shadows. The Hells Angels didn't give up their empire. They passed it on, protected it, and expanded it, all in the name of a brother who used his body as a shield. The takeover of Richard Thorne's assets was not a gentle process. It was a silent corporate coup. Papers were filed by lawyers who asked no questions. Signatures appeared on deeds. Within a week, the Hells Angels' legitimate front, Vanguard Holdings, owned not only their original lots in the industrial zone, but also Thorne's entire development project. The news barely made a ripple in the business section. Developer Richard Thorne sells prime Southside Holdings to pursue other ventures. Thorne wasn't in his penthouse anymore. He was in a modest, heavily monitored apartment downtown, a gilded cage. He showed up at the occasional city function, smiling tightly, but his eyes were hollow. David or Paul would often be there too, in sharp suits, nodding at him from across the room, a constant, silent reminder. Their silent partner was now truly silent. At the diner, Mercy found an envelope taped to the door one morning. Inside were the new property titles, now in her name, and a simple note in strong, slanted handwriting. "No rent, just keep the coffee hot." She cried, then laughed, then got to work. The diner got a fresh coat of paint, a new sign that simply read Mercy's, and a security system installed by Paul himself. The first morning it reopened, the entire chapter rolled in on their bikes, filling every booth and stool. The roar was now a welcome sound. Life in the club adjusted to a new rhythm. David, as the new president, was different from Mark. Mark had been a peacemaker, a strategist. David was a protector, a hammer, but he was learning. The club's money was cleaner than it had ever been, thanks to Thorne's funneled funds, but the street business, the protection, the gentle persuasions, still existed. It was their roots. A month after the funeral, David was in the clubhouse office, going over ledgers, when Alina walked in. She placed 2 fingers of whiskey on the desk and sat down. "You're doing good, David," she said. "Doesn't feel like it," he grunted. "Feels like I'm wearing another man's skin." "It's his cut," Alina corrected softly, "and it fits you. He chose you a long time ago." She sipped her drink. "He'd be proud, and he'd tell you to stop mopping and live a little." David sighed, looking out the grimy window. "The suit still feels wrong." Alina laughed. "Not that, Mercy. She asks about you every time I stop by for pie." David felt a strange, unfamiliar twinge. She's just being polite. She's a woman who watched a man die for her and then saw the family he left behind move heaven and earth to make it right. That's not polite. That's connected. David didn't answer, but the next afternoon, instead of sending a prospect, he rode down to Mercy's himself. The bell jingled. The place was empty between lunch and dinner. Mercy was at the counter, wiping it down. She looked up, and a genuine smile broke across her face. "Mr. President," she said, "to what do I owe the honor?" "Just David, and I was in the neighborhood. Coffee black." She poured it, her movements sure and calm now. She slid the cup to him. Their fingers touched again. This time, neither pulled away. "How's the landlord business?" she asked, leaning on the counter. "Boring, prefer the other business." "The one that involves shutting down city blocks?" she asked, her voice teasing but her eyes serious. "That's the one," he took a sip. "You're not scared of us, of everything." Mercy thought about it. "I was scared that night. More scared than I've ever been. But then, I saw what family really looks like. It doesn't look perfect. It looks like a bunch of rough men in leather who will tear the world apart for one of their own. There's an honesty in that, a terrible, beautiful honesty." She looked him dead in the eye. "So no, David, I'm not scared." The air between them crackled. It was a charged, adult moment, full of unspoken promises and shared trauma, but it was safe, real. He reached out and covered her hand with his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a vow. "Good," he said, his voice rough, "because I think I'm gonna be here for a lot of coffees." Their romance was not a whirlwind. It was a slow, steady burn. A late-night conversation after closing, his hand on the small of her back as he guided her through a crowded bar. A shared laugh when Paul tried and failed to fix her sink, flooding the kitchen. It was grounded in the real, bloody truth of how they met, which made the quiet moments sweeter. Meanwhile, the club faced a new, unexpected problem: success. With Thorne's capital, their legitimate businesses exploded. The sanitation company won a citywide contract. The security firm started guarding high-end boutiques. It created a funny sight: hardened bikers in boardrooms and prospects in security uniforms directing traffic at a fashion show. One day, Paul walked into the clubhouse holding a floral patterned invoice. "You gotta see this," he said to David, trying not to laugh. "We just got hired to provide atmosphere and security for a yoga retreat. In the mountains, they want aesthetic, rugged individuals. I think they mean us." David stared at him. "A yoga retreat?" "Yep, they're paying 10 grand for the weekend." The room erupted in laughter. Big, bearded men clutching their sides. It was the light-hearted, comedic moment they desperately needed. After the laughter died down, David wiped his eyes. "We take it, but we're not doing the yoga." The weekend was a surreal comedy. 6 massive Hell's Angels in their cuts stood silently at the perimeter of a serene meadow where 50 people in pastel leggings contorted themselves into poses. The bikers looked profoundly confused but professional. At one point, the yoga instructor, a serene woman named Luna, asked David if he'd like to try a simple mountain pose to ground his energy. David, stone-faced, replied, "Ma'am, I'm on a motorcycle 6 hours a day. I'm plenty grounded." Paul snorted so hard he choked. They got a 5-star review. The security team provided a profound, stabilizing presence. It read. The brothers framed it and hung it in the clubhouse bathroom. But the real world was never far away. A message came through from an old ally in a neighboring state. A new crew, calling themselves the Reapers, were making noises, hearing about the soft angels who did security for yoga retreats. They thought it was a sign of weakness. David called a church meeting. They think we've gone corporate. They think we've forgotten who we are. He looked around the room at his brothers, in their cuts, their faces set. We need to remind them, but we don't start a war. We end one before it begins. The plan was a show of force, but a smart one. The Reapers were having a big run to celebrate their founding. It would cross through 3 counties. David used their new resources. Leo tracked the Reapers, planned route via social media posts. The sanitation company accidentally spilled a non-hazardous but smelly slurry on a key stretch of their highway, forcing a detour. The detour led them down a lonely, forested back road. As the Reapers' convoy of 24 bikes came around a bend, they found the road completely blocked, not by police, not by trash trucks, by the entire Hell's Angels chapter. They weren't on their bikes. They were standing in a solid line across the asphalt, arms crossed, cuts on, facing the oncoming riders. Behind them, parked sideways, were their own bikes, and behind those, the gleaming trucks of their security and towing companies, lights flashing. The Reapers skidded to a halt. Their president, a young, cocky guy, got off his bike and swaggered up. "This a problem?" David stepped forward. "Could be. We heard you think we're soft. We heard you think our territory is ripe. We are here to give you a one-time free lesson." He pointed to the trucks, the men. "You see this? This isn't us going soft. This is us getting powerful. We own the roads you ride on. We own the trucks that would tow your bikes if you fall. We have friends in every office in this city. You start a war with us, you're not just fighting bikers, you're fighting a corporation. You're fighting the city itself." He walked right up to the Reaper president. "So you can turn around, ride home, and tell your boys to stay away, or you can make your move right now." David opened his arms wide, mimicking Mark's final pose. "But know this, we don't just fight for turf anymore. We fight for a brother in the ground, and that makes us the most dangerous thing you'll ever meet." The silence was total. The young president looked at the unbroken line of men, at the machinery, at the cold certainty in David's eyes. He saw no fear, only a weary, ready fury. He swallowed. "No problem," he said, his voice quieter. "We were just out for a ride." "Good," David said. "Enjoy the scenery. It's a long way back." The Reapers turned their bikes around, one by one, and rode off. The Angels didn't cheer. They just watched until the last taillight disappeared. Then they shared a round of cigarettes, a few quiet nods, and got back on their bikes. The message had been sent. The empire was not just held with fists, but with reach. That night, David went to Mercy's. It was after midnight, and she was doing books in the back. He walked in, the smell of grease and coffee welcoming him. He looked tired. "Long day?" she asked, coming out from the back. "Long month," he said. He walked over to her, wrapped his arms around her, and just held her, burying his face in her hair. She held him back, strong and steady. "You did good today," she whispered, as if she knew. Maybe she did. The diner was a hub of information. "How do you know?" he murmured. "Because you're here," she said simply, "and you're not bleeding." He laughed, a low, warm sound against her neck. He pulled back and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was full of the day's tension, the month's grief, and the fierce, desperate hope for a future. It was charged, it was adult, it was real. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Move in with me," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a request. "Your place is a fortress full of sweaty bikers and gun oil," she teased. "I'll get a new one, a quiet one, with a garage for the bike." She smiled. "Okay." 3 months later, they stood in the newly renovated diner for a different kind of gathering. A wedding. It was small. Just the club, Elena, a few close friends. Mercy wore a simple white dress. David wore his cut over a clean black shirt. Paul stood up as the best man. He cleared his throat, holding a beer. I'm not good at speeches, he began, but David was my brother before he was my president. And Mercy, you walked into hell and didn't flinch. You're one of us now, not because of what happened, but because of who you are. He raised his bottle. To the president and the first lady of the diner, may your coffee always be strong and your roads always be clear. The cheer shook the windows. Later, under a string of lights in the parking lot, David danced with his wife. Elena danced with Paul, both of them smiling in a way they hadn't in years. The club was whole. It was changed, but it was strong. They hadn't given up their empire. They had evolved it, protected it, and added to its heart. In a quiet moment, David led Mercy to the spot where Mark had fallen. A small, discreet plaque was now embedded in the floor behind the counter. It read, "He stood his ground. For a brother, for a friend, for a stranger, we ride because he did." Mercy touched the plaque, then took David's hand. "He brought us together," she said. "He protected what mattered," David replied, squeezing her hand. "And now so do we." Outside, the city hummed, oblivious and bright. The Hell's Angels didn't rule it all. But in their corners, in their businesses, and in their newfound peace, they built a kingdom of loyalty, brick by brick. A kingdom that started the day a man used his body as a shield and whispered a word that started a war, and ended with a love that secured the peace. Thank you for riding with us on this intense journey. This story makes you wonder, what would you do to protect your family? If this loyalty shocked you, hit subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you think Mercy made the right choice.